Today's webinar is called How to Satisfy Customers with a Change in Software Delivery. It features Forrester Researcher Amy DeMartine and Pythian's Chief Digital Officer Aaron Lee. They're going to talk today about the race that's going on among software companies, the race to deliver the best customer experience with faster and better software releases, and they're also going to explain what's driving this race and how you can get yourself out in front. So now I'll turn it over to them.
Hi everyone, and welcome to How to Satisfy Your Customers with a Change in Software Delivery. Today we'll be talking about why software is the key to success in the age of the customer, and why faster software releases actually leads to better customer experience, and then how continuous delivery is dependent on automation. Forrester defines the current age that we're in as the age of the customer. It is a 20-year cycle starting in the year 2010. And it really talks about the empowered customer of today. And if we do a little history lesson and we look at the different ages we've been in since 1900 to 1960, age of manufacturing, big story here, Ford with industrialization, 1960 to 1990, the age of distribution, getting things to the right places at the right time to the right people, big story here being UPS. In the age of information, 1990 to 2010, and you'll see as we go, these ages are going faster and faster and faster. So the first age of manufacturing was 60 years, age of distribution was 30 years. Now in the age of information, it's only 20 years, and the big news here is, of course, folks like Google, where you can access information from around the world while sitting at your computer. And now that brings us back to the age of the customer, where the story is, how do companies really reach these consumers where brand loyalty means nothing? Now it's loyalty to the customer experience. The big name here, of course, or names are folks like Amazon, who are able, say they're going to be able to not only predict what I'm going to buy, they'll actually ship it before I click buy. And to do that takes a level of customer obsession that we haven't seen before. So if we go through these uber trends of the age of the customer, the first one is what I just touched on, which is customer obsession. We all have to become customer obsessed. What are our customers doing with our products and services? And usually what they're doing with our products and services has to do somehow with a mobile application, where there's been a shift. Consumers are now interacting more and more with products and services over their mobile devices. And that leads us to the digital business, where software really drives a lot of those interactions, whether they be a mobile app or our traditional PC applications. And then finally, big data. Going back to that example of Amazon, the idea that they're going to be able to predict what I buy takes an incredible amount of data that they're going to have to correlate not only for me, but all their other users to be able to predict what I'm going to buy based on my previous purchases. So the business goals in the age of the customer, there's two top ones that I really want to talk about. The first one is our priorities in the next 12 months is to, one, improve the experience of our customers. And then paired with that at the same percentage is actually to grow revenues. And in the age of the customer, that's exactly what we'd expect to see. The customer experience and growing revenues are paired. Unfortunately, in our recent DevOps survey, we found that 38% of infrastructure and operations DevOps respondents, they didn't even know if customer experience was measured at their company. So not only do they not know it's measured, but certainly they can't use it to influence their work. What we see today, going back to digital disruption, is connecting through software. And maybe that's a mobile app. Maybe that's an e-commerce website on your computer. But regardless, it's all software powered. And users come in through some systems of engagement, but we can't forget this underlying support of the systems engagement come from two places. First of all, our traditional systems of record. And then second of all, these systems of automation, things that take data and transform them for the systems of engagement.
Thanks, Amy. That was great. So I want to draw a linkage between this software-driven system of engagement and of storage and of record, with our customer and the process of creating that software and operating it at global scale. when you start asking questions like, how do we make an organization measurably better at creating software and operating it, it leads you to this topic of DevOps, which is obviously portmanteau of development and operations. It's about the collaboration that happens between those groups, and in fact, between them and the rest of the organization that they support and that supports them. And so the interesting point I want to make about DevOps here is that it is, as Amy will tell us, primarily a cultural motion. It's certainly associated with tools, technologies, techniques, different ways of organizing. Those are all expressions of this cultural transition. But I think the cultural transition actually boils down to this. We can expect people to use their judgment to advance a shared agenda that all of us have, and to do so more and more effectively over time when they can frequently iterate the decision and action cycles that are inherent to collaboration. When there is a radical level of transparency, when the entire group collaborating shares the same information, the same goals, and when rich feedback loops exist, when it is both true and possible that within that group, the learnings that different parts of the group have, whether it's QA discovering bugs post-live, whether it's operations seeing repetitive patterns and connections that somebody in dev should look at, whether it's dev noticing operations doing things repetitively that could be automated away. It's actually in the engagement of the feedback loops that allow for that kind of context to be transmitted across the group that the benefits of DevOps, meaning enhancements to development and operations productivity, arise. And you can see that when you can see those impacts in the form of higher velocity, in other words, being faster and better to market with the right functionality, with the right customer experience, and ultimately the operational excellence that is support for that customer experience, the performance, the availability, the cost efficiency, and the security that customer experience has delivered. So this concept of DevOps is really a reaction to the fact that all non-trivial businesses are now software businesses and therefore seek to competitively differentiate themselves through the productivity of their software engineering and operations processes.
All right, so if we think about what Aaron just mentioned, and then we talk about, okay, what we're really trying to do is get to faster and faster releases. DevOps leads us down the path to continuous delivery. And the reason we want to go there is because of what's depicted here, where if you're able to measure your customer experience, you're going to be able to measure then the satisfaction gap. And our customers are going to have satisfaction gap. They always are. Whether it's on what we just currently developed or whether it's because of some other app developed in some other industry has raised the level of customer expectation. What we need to do is measure our customer experience, measure our satisfaction gap, and then quickly create a solution to narrow that gap. And if you think about being able to do that cycle quicker and quicker and quicker, you're able then to decrease that gap, chip away at that satisfaction gap, and quickly respond to new and changing dynamics in the marketplace. The benefits of doing this are these 5 points that I'd like to cover. The first one is you don't have as much scrap and rework because you're doing it very quickly, because you're responding to a gap that you just heard about. You can quickly do that piece of work and then test again. You're also not doing a huge amount of work and then testing and only finding that a little bit of it was successful. You're only doing a little bit of work, so if you have to redo it, you've only lost a little bit of time. The next thing, of course, is to outpace your competitors. This is how you get ahead of what they're delivering. Another way, of course, higher customer satisfaction because you're chipping away at that customer satisfaction gap. And then also higher employee satisfaction. Employees are happier because they know exactly what they're doing and why to meet that customer expectation gap. And then, and this is going to seem contrary, more stable releases. And we'll talk about why that is in a slide or two, but really what we're doing is smaller and smaller releases, and oddly enough, that means more stable releases.
When you start to ask the question, how do you measure the impact of that improved collaboration or closing that expectation and customer desire gap? We think there are roughly 5 areas where you can look to see the output of any given DevOps lifecycle or development and operations lifecycle And those are velocity, performance, availability, cost efficiency, and security, compliance, and privacy. These are a fairly generic way to look at the output of any software engineering process, but they lead you back to the same set of conclusions, the story that Amy is unfolding for us, which is that velocity is basically software gold. It's a currency that allows you to purchase features and functionality, entries to new markets, new forms of interaction that may leapfrog your competition or advantage you in your market. So that the capability or the overall performance of your engineering process leads to a certain level of velocity, and you can then use that velocity to buy the kind of customer experience that your customer demands. When you break down the operations side of that story, we really think there are 4 areas where you can see the impact of better collaboration. Obviously, availability is key. The application has to be there when it's supposed to be, when the consumer wants to interact with it. Performance is just as important. It has to be perceived to perform at the pace of the customer's need, and certainly needs to be perceived as comparable or better than its competitors. Cost efficiency, and especially marginal cost efficiency, the degree to which costs scale linearly or non-linearly with the size and scale of the customer base, is a really important topic. And over time, you'll see that better collaboration and better automation does drive down those marginal costs. And finally, security is obviously a hugely important topic for all of us. And rapid iteration and the vigilant extermination of technical debt actually lead you to a place where it is easier to provide a higher level of security over time. Just so that we talk a little bit about how Pythian sees companies implementing the infrastructure that supports these improved collaborations over time. We lay out a pretty simple stack. These are just building blocks of better infrastructure and of infrastructure that supports that optimized process. The first thing that we like to talk about is that it's important to be able to link all these activities back to a business strategy. So there is a need to be able to identify these KPIs, or these indicators of customer experience, to measure their changes, the impacts of changes you make to that collaborative system over time, and to be able to show that impact not only on the engineering side, but on the business side. When it comes to preparing the engineering organization and the product it works on to be successful at this, it does start with application and infrastructure architecture. It's all software, so anything is theoretically possible, but to produce these kinds of impacts in economically efficient time and space, it certainly helps to have adopted architecture and infrastructure that supports that. This is a key element of our practice and a key aspect of the sort of analysis that one wants to go through when heading down this path. Operational visibility is a key building block in any environment, but it's worth noting that when one accelerates velocity, when one goes from a monthly release or a bi-weekly release to a daily release, or even multiple times per day, what's happened is you've taken your nice little red sports car that was driving happily down the road in the bright sunny day, and you suddenly accelerated it to 100 miles an hour and driven it down a twisty road in the fog with no headlights, because now that pace of change has exceeded the company's existing ability to understand the operational characteristics of its systems and to make predictions about them. So putting a level of operational visibility in place, this is metrics, monitoring, alerts, escalation, the ability to have introspection into those systems and their states. That is an important building block. Environment automation. If you can't go from one button press to a working, tested and validated non-production or production environment, then it's likely that there is automation arbitrage or technical debt left in your delivery pipeline. This is a key area of impact. Test automation and continuous integration. This is really where you begin to knit together the benefits of automation at the point of the development lifecycle. This is how you reduce the work in progress, as Amy talked about, and how you provide nearly instantaneous feedback to the people working on developing a product. That instantaneous feedback greatly improves the efficiency of the collaboration, because, of course, the less time you have to wait for that sort of feedback, the less rethinking or the less loss of context occurs in between inputs. And finally, when you make it to the point of continuous delivery, a state in which a system can be iterated on an automated basis, This really is the pinnacle of productivity that we see in the field today, and ultimately the guiding light for DevOps practitioners in the field.
Great. So let's look at what continuous delivery really looks like. So in the traditional service delivery lifecycle, we have this big payload, that's the truck, where releases maybe took a year and a half, 2 years, not uncommon. And what you do is you kind of go through the lifecycle in this linear fashion from getting requirements all the way through run. And the unfortunate part, of course, is you do all these changes. It was virtually impossible to test because the interaction of all those different changes was very hard to pinpoint. And then on top of it, there really wasn't any feedback. So any knowledge gained in the test cycle, for example, wasn't fed back into development. And worse, the information that's gained in the run cycle, where you're actually running the product, so you understand what that environment needed to look like, gets lost as the truck just falls right off the end. Now, in the modern service delivery lifecycle, we talked about these little teeny releases, very targeted at specific customer expectation gaps. And if you release almost nearly continuously, or really at the demand of your business, maybe your demand isn't hourly, maybe your demand is monthly or weekly. When you start doing these nearly continuous releases, in addition to adding all these feedback loops, feedback and feed-forward loops, the information is cross-shared. So as you are developing this product, you're also increasing the quality of this product. And because these little teeny tiny releases are very focused, it's very easy to focus the testing and narrow down the interactions that each new piece of code will have on the rest of the product. So you're actually doing a better job testing. And so you are more confident in what you're releasing, and you're not losing that information that you previously lost in the run phase. So you're redesigning your product to actually fit the production environment better. These are our recommended 7 habits of highly effective DevOps. And it's important to note that today DevOps still is mainly a cultural shift, of course supported by the right processes and tools, but really culture is the #1 enemy for DevOps. The first thing that we recommend that you do is to actually have Dev and Ops meet each other. It's very common in organizations where they don't know who they are, and it's very difficult to trust someone you haven't met before, but worse, it's very difficult to value what they do unless you can talk to them and understand what their day in the life of is. So definitely meeting, that certainly is the first big step. Possibly doing a day in the life of, both from Dev and on Ops, visiting each other, understanding the challenges, the unique challenges that are presented to each of them. The next one is to see everything through the eyes of the customer, and by that I mean we all have to get behind the same metrics. Dev is usually measured on velocity, which Aaron had talked about before. They are all about speed. Versus operations, which is usually measured on reliability. And in the past, where we weren't doing these very small targeted releases, and this big release came and was kind of given to operations, and then Dev wiped their hands clean of the release and gleefully ran away, it was very difficult because we're working at cross purposes. Velocity and reliability were not the same. And so Dev didn't want to hand over to Ops these new releases, and Ops didn't want to take the new releases. But if we take a step back and we think, what are we delivering this for? And we really think about, okay, how do we measure customer experience? That joins both groups in a common goal. Customers aren't going to be happy if the product doesn't run well, if it's not available, if it's not performant, and it's also they're not going to be happy if it doesn't have the right features and functionality. The next one is to streamline your application delivery pipeline. The way to do that is automation. First 2 should probably be build and test. So if you haven't already done those, that's where to start. And then after that, building that environment creation that Aaron was talking about, automating that eliminates a whole host of problems of it works on my machine. And then release management after that. And talking about environment creation, that's really the highlight of number 4 with the loosely coupled service-oriented architecture. When developing those pieces of the environment creation, if they're reusable pieces, then building new applications that are based on those reusable pieces actually becomes easier and easier. And then The next one is to reward simplicity and reliability, making everything that we do extremely lean, removing the debt that we have, not only on the technical side, but on the process side. We'll talk about that in a slide or two. And then the next one is improve how we're using customer experience data. This tribal data needs to be included from the requirements phase all the way through the run phase. And then the last is we all need to walk in each other's shoes. So for dev, unfortunately, this means that they need to be put in support roles so they can actually see what that customer impact is of their products. And ops doesn't get away from this for free either. They need to really start joining those stand-up meetings. The pressure that dev is under to meet customer expectations as well as the business can be quite high. And so understanding what that looks like on a day-to-day basis is important. Now, we talked about how you can actually get reliability and speed, and it's not a paradox. But to do that, we have to take a step back and look at our debt, technical as well as process debt. Unfortunately, what happens as a process lives is we build up a lot of bloat. Something has happened in our process, something gets an availability issue, and so we add a particular check, or we add an approval stage, or we add a manual step. And over time, our processes become very lengthy and filled with all of this not customer valuable stuff. And so we need to look at our processes very carefully and make sure they're extremely streamlined, and that will help us to make a release cycle that's very quick. I got to caution everybody, though, and going back to the mobile application example, today's applications are extremely complex. We've got on-premise stuff, cloud, both public and private. You might be pushing stuff out to the Apple Store, iTunes Store, and you may be releasing these parts independently. You may be releasing them as one piece of work. And so when you think about designing and modeling applications and your release cycle, because of course this thing has to move through something probably like development, test, and production. And as you think about how this moves forward and multiple releases all happening at the same time, you're right to be feeling a little queasy at this moment because this is extremely complex. And the only way to get through this is automation. Without it, you will be bogged down and mired down, and there will be tons of issues, especially of the two-legged variety, where your release process will get stuck, and you will not realize the benefits of continuous delivery in DevOps. Automation is good for everything. And it's, whether it's repetitive tasks, testing, of course, is a huge area where you can see great improvements. We talked about release automation, but even analytics, policy decisions, approvals, all of those things. If you can automate them, you will see benefits in removing the bloat in our processes as well as making our processes faster as we go through this continuous delivery. I would love to say that the Lifecycle is supported by a single tool, and it will make your life very easy. Unfortunately, there is no one tool to rule them all. It's a very complex mix of different tools. What this means is you have to insist on automation, even more so than if there was a single tool. Not only do you need to automate the individual steps, we talked about build and test, for example, but you also have to automate the interaction between these tools. You don't want anything to fall through the cracks. You don't want to lose any information. And in fact, if you can take one step and kick off another, even better. So it's very important to focus on automation, not only in the steps, but between. This is an example lifecycle that Forrester has generated with our own research, where we talk about these are the different steps that you need to accomplish, usually the order we see it in, creating a delivery pipeline, then of course breaking it down into small batches of work. This is on the dev side. Then automating that delivery pipeline, and then using kind of continuous testing. And this is a big step for companies to make. And it's the same step that operations has to make, and that is moving from the actual push button to testing to automating, to becoming a test engineer, developing what those tests should look like. I&O needs to do the same thing on release management, where what they're doing is exactly in step 5, doing that loosely coupled architecture, building that environment creation so that the environments are consistent across development, test, and production environments. And so same kind of thing. Instead of manually plugging in computers. They are developing and designing what those environments look like. And then, of course, treat everything as infrastructure as code, whether you're using cloud, private, hybrid, public, whether you're using hardware in your data center, doesn't matter. We really need to start looking at infrastructure as code. And then the last thing is to really eliminate the release drama. It should become a non-event through automation.
Thanks, Amy. Just to dive a little deeper on specific areas of concern and functionalities to evaluate within those areas of concern. When Pythian actually engages with a client to help with the process of DevOps technology, technique, tools, and ultimately culture adoption, we look at these five different areas, and we're able to produce a maturity metric. So we're able to actually talk about how the organization, how its existing process, and its tool selection lead to a particular level of maturity in each of these categories. So just a bit about those. Command and control is really the ability to orchestrate that entire life cycle, the end-to-end view that Amy just showed us. So it's necessary both to be able to perform long-term planning against infrastructure spend, against project execution cycles and the dependencies that they have between them. Of course, if you're working in service-oriented architecture, loosely coupled architecture, you probably have multiple life cycles to coordinate, and so that planning capability becomes more important with the scale of components that you have within your system. Obviously, the ability to operate and to make business decisions about operational expenditures in real time that affect all of your systems is important. So we don't recommend, for example, that the system automatically fail over between regions or cloud providers, but we absolutely recommend that if the human judgment is realized, that is a required step, that everything involved be completely automated. Obviously, that also speaks to the ability to respond to emergent issues. And ultimately, this level of control and visibility is necessary to be able to optimize both productivity and spend over time. From an architecture design standpoint, we spend a lot of time looking at the degree to which a system is or is not loosely coupled, characterizing it in that way, and providing recommendations for ways to decouple when that's appropriate. Obviously, there's a lot of buzzword and discussion about service-oriented architecture, about microservices, about decomposition. This is an area where we spend a lot of time helping people plot a future course. From an operational visibility perspective, I talked about this earlier, but really there's sort of four categories of interaction that you have with your operational visibility system. You need to be able to measure. You have to be able to capture and produce and analyze the metrics that we've talked about. There needs to be a single system of record for the preponderance of those metrics so that they can be easily published. They can be easily shared with the entire organization. It needs to be possible to quickly diagnose and resolve issues that do arise at any point in the life cycle, production or otherwise. This area of operational visibility focus really leads to impact on MTTR, mean time to resolve, both, again, in the production and non-production context. And finally, to use customer experience and customer impact as the guiding intention and sort of the guiding point of visibility for the entire organization requires that once you've measured the relevant impacts, the events, and the metrics associated with that experience, that they be reported, that they be modeled, and that the organization itself be incentivized to maintain and change them over time. And so the ability to provide that kind of SLA reporting should come out of your operational visibility environment. Environment automation, obviously you need to be able to provision production and non-production. Scaling, self-repair, and migration tend to be the three other areas where people have in the past spent a lot of time manually keystroking their way through things. These tend to be the areas to focus from an automation perspective, first and foremost.
Great. So when we did our recent survey, we actually found that only 14% of our infrastructure and operations DevOps respondents said that they were doing full release process automation. So we have a long way to go. This is clearly in its infancy, but to reach these speeds of monthly or weekly or daily releases, whichever your business says is right for your products and services, to get there, we're going to have to do a lot more automation going forward.
And the good news about that automation and the effort that we put into it is that we have certainly seen in our own research, and we're now beginning to observe it, bubbling up out of other environments, that the degree to which one invests in and actually improves the quality of the internal DevOps lifecycle really sets both an upper bound and provides a real rising tide for the business that makes that investment. The performance of your software creation and operational capability really does set the bar for what you can do from a customer experience perspective. And so this is not some big bang situation. This is a situation where incremental investment in the right kind of automation, culture change, and operational visibility enhancement does lead to immediately measurable impact on customer experience and therefore on competitive advantage.
So what we've seen be the most successful in organizations is to start small, to start with one product or service at a time and then expand. Each company is unique. We have not found yet that there is some sort of cookie-cutter approach to this. There are certainly recommendations and generalizations that we can make about roadmap and metrics and those things, but actually there is probably something in your products and services that is uniquely yours and things that you need to do in your process to meet your own company's internal workings. And so what we found is that companies that start with a single product and create these integrated product teams are quite successful. And it follows a model of a product team that would be generated by R&D, but instead of just putting development in there, you put all sorts of other folks in there. Now, they don't have to sit in the same place. They can certainly be a virtualized team, so reporting in from their original teams, but you want to put people in there like the operations folks. Certainly security is a great idea so that you can get security requirements built in from the beginning. Put in the customer experience folks to understand the customer experience data, understand what you're measuring and what you're missing. Those folks are the best to determine what customers are really out there doing with the product, understanding what the interaction and the journey that they're taking with your product and service. And then, of course, there's other folks, maybe QA, certainly include those guys for the testing part, possibly enterprise architecture folks. Include them all in a single team. And their focus and their goal is the customer experience of that single product. And if you optimize on the tools and the processes and the culture needed to make that product successful, you will learn a lot about what is required in your own company to change other products and services. So for those of you out there who are a C-level or even a VP level who are looking to sponsor this integrated product team of the future, there's a few things you need to do. The first one is to create this integrated product team. Make them feel like they are team members, that they are part of a single goal. You need to enable them to break with tradition. Have them constantly ask, why are we doing this way? Can we improve it? Even if they just improved something, taking a look at it again. How do we do this better? How do we do this differently in the future? Give them time to fix technical and process debt. A company that I recently put in a report, a large bank, they gave an entire sprint, a full 6 weeks, to simply removing technical and process debt. And they made huge improvements in that time. But they were released from having to develop new features. Their goal was, how do we incorporate new features faster in the future? And that full 6 weeks was just improvement. The next thing, of course, is to focus on customer experience metrics and make sure everyone knows what they are, how they're measured, and then where you're at. What are your goals? You have to demand automation at every step. Remove any manual process. Not only will it speed your process, but it will remove any errors introduced by manual steps rather than automation. And then the last thing is as you go through this process, you will find things in your company, whether they be traditional things you've always done this way or interactions from other teams, and there might be roadblocks to the innovation. And your job is to remove any of those roadblocks and make sure that your integrated product team is sailing through their process without any interference from the outside world.
The last series of comments, I think, align very, very nicely with our own experience in the sense that if you are the steward of transformational change within your organization, then it is true that all organizations are different, but I would argue that they all fall somewhere on a risk appetite spectrum. And those that fall towards the risk-averse side of the spectrum tend to have culture which rewards a lack of failure as opposed to meaningful success. And this is one of the areas where that steward has to be really careful. The fact is that what's happening inside the organization is you're sparking a learning process. You're asking people to think differently about the way that they produce value for the organization and the way that they think about changing the org. And so if you don't provide a safe environment for those questions to be asked, for people to fail fast and fail forward, rather than failing out, it will be very hard for them to take on the kind of behaviors and take the kind of risks that do lead to change. I think the notion of single product teams is very nicely aligned with our experience, which is that lighthouse projects or lighthouse transformative efforts that run the gamut of an entire product lifecycle from ideas to implementation tend to be the best way to demonstrate the value of these techniques and collaborative outcomes within an organization, and a great way to produce internal learnings and extract tribal knowledge that can then inform a broader roadmap. And as Amy talked about, aligning that roadmap at all times with the customer experience metrics that are being tracked is certainly critical, not only to the success of the individual project, but ultimately to the organization being able to measure systemically the impact of these changes and, increase or decrease its appetite for change over time. Pythian's methodology for engaging in these sorts of projects really is broken up into two phases. On the Agile consulting side, what we do is we admit to ourselves and the world a couple of important axiomatic elements of consulting and transformative engagement, which is the first of which is if you take all the risk out of some opportunity, then it's likely it's no longer a meaningful opportunity. And so this teaches us that getting into the definition phase early and at the right level of engagement allows us to lay out a roadmap that aligns business objectives with transformative outcomes. Secondly, knowing that we are likely in the course of any non-trivial transformation project to learn things that should change the outcome, to gain insights that we should process and use to adjust targets to better optimize for outcomes, brings us to the transformative element of our engagement, where we're actually using the learnings that we're producing in each cycle of our Agile process, typically once every 2 weeks, and feeding the impact back into the organization, and then using those impacts to drive future prioritization. So we actually are both modeling that process and engaging in it with our client all the way throughout. And once we've reached the level of desired transformation, we then have a set of managed services that help to supplant what are often left in the ways of skill gaps or just organizational inertia that needs some time to catch up. So our ability to support this process from strategy through execution and all the way into the support lifecycle, I think makes it easier and less risky to get started.
All right. So some key takeaways for you. The first is the age of the customer is here. We all have to learn to be customer obsessed. How are our customers interacting with our products and services, and what can we do to make that better? To satisfy customers today, to outpace our competitors, to make sure we aren't left in the dust, we really need to release quicker, and these releases are getting more and more complex. These complexities, the only way to reduce them is through automation, and that's the only way to really figure out how to deliver on speed and quality. Start with a single product and expand, and really give those teams permissions to break old methods and time to create change. And now I will hand it over to Linda for Q&A.
Thank you, Amy and Aaron. It's a fascinating subject, and it's pretty clear that while the benefits are obvious, like many other great ideas, it will take time and effort to do it right. And the questions that I can see coming in echo that sentiment. Let's pick up a few of these and ask them in the minutes that we have remaining. So the first one is, what would you say are the critical success factors from an IT perspective that are required to implement a rapid release software model?
All right, well, I'll take a shot at that first and then let Aaron respond. IT really needs to break the mindset, and Aaron mentioned this fear of change. And this is a huge cultural gap, and I mentioned that DevOps is mainly, at this point, a cultural change, a cultural shift. And this is one of the biggest ones that IT has to break. IT has built change review boards that go through, and everybody has to sit in a room and agree that a change can proceed into production. Those are days in the past. We can't have those kinds of delays in our release process. it just doesn't work. We have to trust that what our developers are building, what our testers are testing in an automated fashion can be trusted to go into the production environment. And so from what I'm seeing, the true success can be measured with IT letting go some of these beliefs that they've had in the past and really embracing the new release cadence. Aaron?
Amy, I totally agree, and I think this is, just to focus on the culture element of this for a moment, I think there are actually a number of what I would consider sort of bipartisan agreements that come with increasing maturity in this area. So when you look at the reason why IT and infrastructure and operations for so long was, I would say, really forced into a very defensive posture. Part of the reason is that that's where everything else goes, right? It's clear what the responsibilities of a product manager are. It's clear where the developer's responsibility tends to start and stop. And then once you look at what happens downstream, you start to find things like Gene Kim mentioned recently, where I think, to paraphrase what he said, is the number of configuration switches in an application tends to be outweighed by the number of configuration switches that are found in the underlying infrastructure, the servers and the services that application sits on, by like an order of magnitude. So what does that mean? That means that the implicit complexity of operations, area of responsibility is enormous, and it puts them in the world of lots of unknown unknowns. And I think that would make anyone risk averse. So I think the question is, how can an operations organization move out of the unknown? And there are a number of great ways to do that today. One of them is certainly to balance the way that operational responsibility is split between dev and ops. Another is to put an explicit boundary around what ops considers its area of responsibility. So now, in other words, ops can have a product. The product is a platform. Ops is responsible for the health and safety and usage of the platform. Dev, however, is held accountable for the health and safety of its code in production, because there's a clean interface between its application code and the platform. And now both sides can be held accountable in a meaningful way, and both sides have sort of limited the risk they're exposed to. So I think bound up in all that is definitely Amy's core message, which is, in order to succeed, ops has to be open to maximizing the opportunity for change instead of minimizing the occurrence of change.
Thank you. A next question coming in is asking whether it's possible to realize any of these benefits without automation or cloud, which are two things that you mentioned.
Once again, I'll take the first shot at this. So can you do it without cloud? I'll take that one first. And the answer is yes, you can. It makes your release very tricky. And when we talk about making sure that your environments are consistent across development, test, and production environments, if you're trying to do this on bare metal, you're going to have to create some sort of automation tools to do that. It is possible, yes. You don't have to use cloud. Cloud can offer lots of automation benefits, but it's not a necessity, but something definitely to be looked at. And then automation in general, you're never going to get to the speeds that you're looking for without partial, if not full, automation. And so tools, everybody's got to gear up with the proper tools, everything from testing, build, continuous integration, release management. They're all tools, environment configuration, they're all tools that we're going to have to become very familiar with to really eliminate the manual errors and to achieve the speeds we're looking for. Aaron?
I certainly couldn't disagree with any of that. And I think I would just add that I think part of the story here is that there's no binary answer to this question. Nobody wants no automation. There's also a level of automation at which there's some curve of diminishing return. It's good enough. But I think the larger story is that all you have to do as an organization to introduce technical and process debt is nothing. Right? If you're not actively looking for opportunities to improve the technology infrastructure and the output of the engineering process, then what is happening, very much, Amy, to your earlier point about sort of organic growth of process over time, what's happening is it's getting worse. And so I think the question is maybe more interesting to answer it in the context of what does an organization have to do to invest on an ongoing basis in an optimal level of automation? so as to avoid growing technical and process debt, or put differently, to stay at a sort of optimal level.
Thank you. Third question. My company is all about KPIs. How would you suggest I measure the impact of these changes?
All right. Well, Aaron, you've got a very complete answer, I'm sure, because you had a whole slide just on measurements. But if I could boil it down to the top two, I would say the first one is customer experience. Everybody has to understand what the customer expects and how you can deliver it better. And so measuring customer experience, I think, is a must. You have to have that. And then the next is velocity. And I know I talked about, development is all about velocity and operations isn't. But when you look at from a requirement to when it actually gets developed, tested, and then put into production, a released version of that code, that is a great way to say, okay, this is what our process looked like. Take that benchmark today. And then as you remove your technical and process debt, you can compare that length of time as you go on. So you can say, okay, before maybe it took us 40 weeks to deliver. Now with this next batch of automation and things we were able to improve, now it's only 14 weeks. And so you can see the improvements over time of what you're doing, the relationship between what you're doing in your process, removing your process and technical debt, and the results to the release time. Aaron?
Great answer. Certainly agree. I would only add that once you've nailed customer experience and velocity, a point of philosophy here is I believe that software developers create value when they are engaged in translating domain knowledge into repeatable software-driven process or user experience. And pretty much all the time they spend doing anything else is just supporting that activity. So if you can make the distinction between those two activities, and most organizations can with a little bit of careful measurement, you'll find out how much non-productive time the engineers in the organization are spending not producing that kind of outcome. And when you can measure it, awesome things happen. You tend to be able to change it. So just as a third leg to that story, being able to measure and distinguish between productive and non-productive time, I think in our experience is a pretty good analog for the level of technical and process debt that may live in an organization.
Thank you. Two more questions. How long is it likely to take to implement these kinds of changes to my software release planning?
I'll go ahead and lead on that one. I think it's probably pretty close to a question we get all the time. The short version is that this is also a situation where our client has the most impact on this answer. We've certainly seen organizations that were at day zero or day one of their existence take an optimized approach from the first step, and that, of course, is the easiest, best, and sort of idealized way to go. It doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, successful businesses reach a place where they decide that the time is ripe and the opportunity is nigh for transformation. And then we get that question. I would say that just in terms of organizational dynamics, the best way to prevent a change from happening is for it to take too long to be proven or to gain trust. And so we like to design engagements that produce meaningful business impact in a well-defined area in no less than 90 days, at first iteration, including some level of upfront planning as well as execution and an assessment phase. Now, transformations like this are first and foremost ongoing. You're always looking for ways to optimize. There's some amount of investment in an organization that's up to date, wants to continue to make. But in a large organization, thousands of employees or more, I think you find that moving from waterfall to agile and moving from sort of disjointed, siloed development and operations to an optimized automation-driven DevOps lifecycle, easily a 12 to 36-month roadmap, depending on the existing footprint of the business.
Super. And the last question, which I think you touched on a little bit, is what exactly does Pythian do to help us with this?
Short version, Pythian's proud of place is that we help lots and lots of organizations get to answers and action against these questions. And, the wonderful part about that is because we get to see it and have these conversations a lot, we can really generalize about the parts that are, in fact, shared from organization to organization, which, by the way, I think are the lion's share of what's happening. Emerging technology creates opportunities for all of us. We all have to apply it in our own way or need to apply it directly to our own businesses. But the steps you take to leverage that emerging technology tend to be very similar. So we bring that experience. We bring the sort of broad view of having done this and engaged in this a lot. And we also bring what we think are, in fact, the most concentrated, focused group of professionals in the world on these topics to bear against any organization's transformational objectives.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we're out of time now. I want to thank the audience for all of the questions. It was very engaging. You know, it's an exciting subject, and if anybody on the call would like to speak to Aaron more about Pythian's experiences in this area, you can just email us at info@pythian.com. Thank you very much again.